Thank you for joining us for the first ever Abba Care podcast, The Geriatric Millenial. In a world that's obsessed with the young, our podcast seeks to bring light to science-based research on aging and aging better. I'm your host, John, and in this podcast, we review the geriatric industry, distill geriatric research, and summarize it for the benefit of a population that typically turns a blind eye to aging and its inevitable issues. In today's episode, we review an article covering caregivers and patients underreporting symptoms related to dementia. In other words, people aren't telling their doctors what's wrong, and the researchers wanted to know just how much was being underreported and why. In today's discussion, we explore why this is happening, what sort of behaviors are being passed off as normal, and what to do if a loved one is experiencing these problems. After the show, feel free to read the research for yourself in the link provided in the show notes. We hope you learned something and enjoy. Hello and welcome to our first ever podcast for Abba Care Assisted Living. This is a new thing for us. So my name is John, and with me today is Victoria, our Director of Nursing. So you can say hello.
Good morning.
I guess it is morning. So this is our first podcast. We're kind of trying this out. We wanted to start it just to sort of get in this space and document and archive what we think is interesting to us. And I think, as we were kind of doing some test runs, this is a really cool way for us to kind of explore these topics and kind of see for ourselves. Would you say so? I mean, we kind of learn from it, I suppose. So hopefully some of you out there will think this is interesting. We're mostly covering things like geriatric research, ways of aging better, taking a lot of the research, kind of distilling it down into something that the everyday person can actually work with and use, whether for a caregiver or for yourself or just people that you know and that sort of things. But again, this is Victoria and also my mother, who is the nurse and owner of Abba Care Assisted Living, and my name is John, and we're looking forward to getting started. Yeah, so let's start with this first bit of research today. We're covering is a 2010 study by Amanda Hunsaker, sorry for the pronunciation, Karen Schmidt, and Jennifer Langler. They were basically studying how we're underreporting doctor's visits, and I'll have a link on the website, and you can actually take a look at it for yourselves. But we just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about this. So to start, I'm going to start with a quote from their research. This quote says, "Recent work suggests that caregivers have an active interest in receiving advice and emotional support from physicians regarding dementia care, yet may be reluctant to seek needed medical care due to lack of knowledge regarding the symptomatology of Alzheimer's disease, including behaviors related to dementia." So that is a lot of technical jargon. If you're not that was kind of hard to say. It's a lot of technical jargon. Excuse me, for somebody who's not necessarily in this field. So, Mom, could you kind of elucidate what does this mean and what is really going on in a doctor's office? Why are people this statement is basically saying people are underreporting. They're not telling their doctors what's wrong with them at a doctor's office. So what's going on there?
The reason is because when people go to the doctor's office, you have to remember that now you have a patient who is older. And so, understandably, when you used to be able to go to the doctor's office by yourself, most of the time, after the age of 70, people start going with a companion.
Sure.
All the literature points out that you take someone with you. So sometimes it's your spouse, sometimes it's your child, your adult child. And so what happens is there is some kind of a conflict of what to say and what not to say, and what needs to be told. And how the old expression says that you don't hang your dirty laundry outside. So you have to discuss that ahead of time on what you have to say. And the other thing is, I think people are just skeptical about if they say something, because most people will have a suspicion that there is something wrong. Say, for instance, forgetfulness. But what happens now is you don't want your doctor to say that you are sick. You really
Right.
don't want to hear that. That
Sure.
there's something wrong with
Well,
you.
and you certainly don't want your partner or your spouse or your kid to say that about you in a doctor's office, right?
Right. So in both the part of the caregiver, I'm going to use the term caregiver for the one who is accompanying this particular patient. It's kind of, you don't want to feel like you're ratting out on your spouse or your partner or
Sure.
your parent.
So it sounds like what you're saying is, on the one end, the patient or the person receiving care obviously does not want to admit any sort of dementia-related behavior, if you will, and then the caregiver also does not want to sort of rat out someone. It doesn't want to be like the squealer of the situation.
Correct.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. So let's go ahead and go into this second quote then, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about dive a little deeper into that. So this second quote says, discussion on dementia-related behaviors is not necessarily more likely to occur when the primary care physician initiates the general discussion on dementia. So that statement basically is saying that a lot of people would blame, like, oh, is it because the doctor doesn't bring it up? And it's like, and it sounds like what this research is saying, it's not that doctors aren't bringing it up, it's that people just aren't talking about it. Do you have any examples of situations, obviously no names, but examples of situations where you feel like people just have a really hard time sort of, there's a sort of conflict of sharing this information with doctors?
Well, I think one of the major issues is some doctors are really not trained to deal with geriatric or older adults. Let's call them older adults. They don't know the right questions to ask. For instance, like in the case of your dad, we walk into a doctor's office and the first question that hit him was, "Are you depressed?" Well, depression is a big concept.
Right.
Sure. So of course, your dad or any patient for that matter will say, "No, I'm not depressed."
Right. No one wants to admit they're depressed in front of a doctor.
Right. So basically, that's one problem. Is some doctors are not geriatrically trained. And the second thing is, again, we go back to the first question, which is, you don't know what to discuss with a doctor if it's something that's appropriate to discuss because you're afraid that your spouse or your parent might not like you discussing that. And here you're sitting with your parent and is kicking your feet because he doesn't want you to discuss something with him. So some of these behaviors don't come out if appropriate questions are not asked. And there are things that a good sensitive geriatric doctor can find out if it's a little bit more intensive.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that it's really a little bit on both parts. On the one end, it's important that the doctor knows how to ask questions, and on the other end, it's important and knows what kind of questions to ask. And on the other end, it's also important that the people receiving care, both partner or caregiver and recipient, both kind of have a game plan about how to talk about it.
Correct. And especially, the patient and the caregiver needs to talk about it.
About like what they're going to discuss.
What they're going to discuss when they get there.
Okay. So the next part of this that I wanted to talk about is they go into this section of the research where they start talking about certain dementia-related behaviors, and they list off some things. And again, you can find all of these things. Anybody listening can find all of these things in the research. And they list off some behaviors that people are underreporting, things that are happening that are actually happening, and a caregiver will say that they're happening, but in the doctor's office they won't say that it's happening. Some of these things, to me, looking over them, just as if a doctor were to ask, I would feel like, well, that's kind of a normal thing, so one of these things is trouble remembering recent events. It's like, well, I don't remember what I did last Saturday, but so I wanted to sort of discuss a couple of these dementia-related behaviors and kind of go over like what's normal to see as a dementia-related behavior, and what's not normal per these definitions. So one of these was starting but not finishing things. Like I start a puzzle at home, or I'll start something, but I won't finish it. I might start the laundry, but maybe not finish it. but I don't have dementia as far as I know. I mean, what does it mean if somebody is starting but not finishing something?
Let me tell you an important, and let me just interject that, the symptoms or behaviors really occur about 10 to 15 years before the person is actually diagnosed.
That's a lot of years ahead. Okay.
So to be honest, you're walking in a doctor's office 10 to 15 years later.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted, everybody to know that. So here you are, some behavior that you have manifested 10 to 15 years ago. You're just thinking that there's something wrong with that. So now, these behaviors, like for instance, what you were saying is...
starting but not finishing things.
Starting but not finishing, Some of them are really something that, some personalities do and some don't. So when it actually, develops, then you don't really see it. You don't really identify it right away. Now, there are other behaviors that are more evident than others.
Okay.
And this one is probably what I will say is probably not the outstanding behaviors that I see mostly in my practice.
Okay, like what sort of outstanding behaviors? Like what would be an outstanding behavior to you?
I tell you what, the most common thing, and I know forgetting things is one thing.
Right. Everyone thinks dementia, they forget things, but everyone forgets things.
Everyone forgets. You walk in a room and you forget something.
Right.
In my practice, this is what I believe. If the forgetfulness gets to a point where in the safety of the person is compromised, then you start worrying. If you see that the forgetfulness becomes or affects the execution of certain tasks, then you start worrying. For instance, you walk into the room, you don't know where your keys are, you forget what you were going to get. That's something that happens normally.
Right.
But for instance, if you're making some coffee and you cannot figure out whether you're going to put the creamer first or you're putting the creamer in a separate cup, and I've seen this happen. People put the creamer in a separate cup than the coffee they're going to put it in.
Okay.
Then that affects the memory of the person. And that becomes an executing problem. Because now he can't complete a task. And maybe that's the starting and not finishing things. Maybe that needs to be expounded. So like people, and this has actually happened, when I was doing home visits many years ago. A patient heated some water, put some coffee in it, and now she gets the sugar and puts it in another cup. Now, that's a big problem.
Okay.
So also when caregivers report that the forgetfulness is forgetting to turn off the cooking range. Right. Then you can burn something. You can burn the house,
Right.
So, or forgetting to lock the door, So those are things that should trigger a safety response from the caregiver or from the child,
Sure.
So that this can be targeted appropriately. So I guess what I'm trying to say is forgetfulness in itself, the way I perceive it as a nurse, is not an issue until you see that it becomes a problem wherein a person's safety is compromised.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. So it's like, hey, I forgot my wallet, I forgot XYZ. That's not a big problem. But when it starts to be things like, I forgot to turn off the stove, or I forgot, or I just put toothpaste on two separate toothbrushes or something like that, not thinking, not realizing I already had one toothbrush out. Like that's a recent event. Like you already have the certain toothbrush.
Correct. It starts off as just really, really little things, and then it becomes a life and safety issue for the person.
Okay, yeah. So I think that's a great benchmark moving forward, is the idea that it's life and safety is really what to kind of like, is this particular behavior putting them in danger? And if it is, then we need to start really thinking about or maybe even an impediment to just activities of daily living, like things that you might just a normal person might be able to do. So let's move into some of, because this was really strange to me. One of the things that was underreported was disruptive behaviors. And so I don't know if this has to do with embarrassment, or if it has to, like, you're embarrassed to talk about the disruptive behavior, or if maybe, like, sometimes you think, oh, that's just how this person is, but some of these behaviors were things like talking loudly, or engaging in behavior that's potentially dangerous, or doing things that's embarrassing to you. Like, can you kind of talk about, like, what, like, okay, like, let's hone in. Talking loudly. Like, people can talk loudly. There are some people who are a little bit loud, but when does it become like, okay, now we've crossed the line. That's not appropriate. Like, what do you feel, or what do you feel like are disruptive behaviors that it's like, that is a clear indicator that you really need to talk to someone?
Yeah, well, disruptive behaviors, in your example about, talking loudly in an inappropriate place causes a lot of embarrassment for whoever is with them. And,
Sure.
That's really one of the ways while people start isolating themselves is because they're embarrassed now to take their spouse with them to go to a friend's house because of this type of behaviors.
Right.
Or they could be like going around in their friend's house, just going from room to room. Those are disruptive behaviors. So it is inappropriate, and those are things that really need to be discussed with the doctor. Because it might also be that there might be vitamin imbalance, that can be addressed. So a good physical from a doctor who understands the symptoms, has to be done, has to be made.
Sure.
And actually, I would discuss it with a person kind of heart to heart, like the patient, and say, hey, this is really not appropriate. It needs to be, you need to call it out, because sometimes, the person is not even aware
that it's
that it's happening.
Yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of other disruptive behaviors. One other common one is like you used to taking your partner to a restaurant or something, and then you eat, and then all of a sudden your spouse or your partner starts eating with his hands and slaughter up the food, and that's very, very disruptive to other people in the same restaurant.
Right. So just to kind of go back to the research, so a lot of these disruptive behaviors, it's like like it's pretty blatant, it's pretty obvious. So it really does come down to people just aren't talking about this, because that would make sense. It's a little embarrassing to talk to somebody about, like, well, my husband was eating with his hands at the restaurant the other day, and I think that's a very vulnerable thing to talk about. So moving forward, so just in case, if there's anyone listening to this and they do know that a partner, a friend, a friend's partner, a husband, a spouse, a mother, a father, or something like that is doing these behaviors, what do you suggest that those people do? What's a good next step?
Well, when it's compromising life and safety, my first thing is put safety measures in place. If the person still drives, I would put something like a GPS in the car, so that that the person might go somewhere and get lost.
Sure, yeah.
And sometimes memory loss just comes in. A person might be driving every day to work, and all of a sudden one day, they were detoured, and now he or she couldn't find his way back.
Right.
So a GPS would be good, or something like putting a timer on your cooking range, and that way it will automatically shut it off. Or, just turning off the range to begin with. And just not have the person cook at all. If it was your parent, putting those things in place will be a good thing. And then for things like disruptive behaviors, there are medications that the doctors can give for, to kind of help with that, depending on what the problem is, if it's a vitamin deficiency or whatever. So I think that needs to be discussed before the doctor's visit, and so that it can be addressed.
Well, that makes a lot of sense, because essentially there's a lot of these behaviors that can kind of be curbed, is what it sounds like. And so it's all the more that it's important that if you could tell the doctor, then you can help some of these behaviors out, and then maybe not have to worry about the stove or the keys quite as much if you actually are able to have an honest discussion with the doctor about some of these things.
Right.
Next question here that I wanted to talk about is, let's just say we do want to go to the doctor. What are some quick, easy steps to just making that doctor's visit a little more productive?
Oh, the very first one, which I think I've repeated over and over is discuss the purpose of the visit before you go to the doctor. Discuss it with a patient.
Okay.
If it was your parent, then you tell them, I'm really going to bring this up with a doctor. And you might find a lot of resistance with that because that's just a normal reaction for people. But how I would approach it to her or him is say, because we need to understand what's going on, because if there are things that we can use to patch this up or fix this up, then we need to do it now while it's early instead of waiting so long. So sometimes how you bring it up to the person really matters, that you're trying to help him.
Yeah.
The second thing is that, see what other resources that you have, other than just the doctor. And if you can, call the doctor's office and find out, is there a way to communicate the doctor ahead of time, if it's something that the patient is resistant to.
Is that allowed? Like, are you allowed as a daughter or a son or as a wife, as a spouse, to communicate with the doctor, like, hey, this is happening, I don't know how to talk to you about it? That's
a good question, but the way I perceive it, and I think most doctors would agree with me, is that discussing something like that, but about behaviors, gives an opportunity for the doctor to zero out on it when you go to the doctor's office, so that he can confirm that with the patient. And I've actually given that advice to a family who was taking her mom to the doctor, and I said, just go ahead and call the doctor's office and see what they say. See if these are something that they have seen the patient exhibiting. For instance, it's agitation. And once you get to the doctor's office, then the doctor will have an opportunity to confirm that. There are also tests that can be done, to see whether the memory problem of the patient is like mild, moderate, or severe. There is the mini mental test, there's the mini cog. So there's a lot of tests that are objective tests that would point out.
So a doctor will know. In other words, you can tell the doctor ahead of time, and then at least that way they can confirm whether or not they can kind of identify it themselves. Whether or not sort of verify the truth of the statement, so that it's not just like some guy who says my mother has dementia, and they're like, no, she doesn't.
Correct. I mean, it's not like and some patients will say this. I don't want to talk about my mom to this doctor, But if I always say, if you're always in good faith and you're really thinking of the benefit of the patient, then the doctor's only recourse would be to investigate that. And it can be investigated during the process of the doctor's visit.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. The last thing that I want to talk about is the research covers a lot of this, and it basically says, actually, I'm just going to read this quote here. Although primary care physicians have been shown to identify the types of supportive programming that might be helpful to caregivers in managing dementia, they may lack awareness of the specific services available within the community, especially targeted towards managing behaviors, the quality of those services, and the related costs. Primary care-based nursing and social work staff may be better suited to provide these service referrals to caregivers and care recipients. So, we kind of talked about this a moment ago. Like, we kind of look at doctors as the gurus of health and that sort of thing. And this statement seems to say, hey, in the case of dementia, you might need to approach some other services. What are your thoughts on that? Like, what other services could people approach in terms of getting help with behaviors and that sort of thing?
I really wish we had, like some countries have, their geriatric centers have all the resources in place. But if your doctor doesn't have that, then they should be able to refer you to organizations and local networks that can help you. For instance, a home health agency is a good one because they have nurses who are actually trained to look at problems within the home. And how best do we see these problems then in our home? Because in our home, we're ourselves.
Sure.
It's so much different with when you're in the hospital. You can pretend to be somebody else, but when you're at home, nurses see the problems that's happening at home. So nurses will be good ones through home health agencies, or social workers are another good resources. And then you have your organizations, like local organizations like the Alzheimer's Association and other geriatric centers, your Parkinson's Association. And then you have, last but not the least, and my favorite one is caregiver support groups. Because caregiver support groups are actually a group of people who have taken upon themselves to share what they went through and how best do you get those information from those who've already gone through that issues. So
sure, certainly.
So yeah, I love caregiver support groups, and you can find them in your social media most of the time.
Oh, okay, yeah. So a lot of like Facebook and Twitter,
Yes.
things like that. Just a little basic search.
Right.
Okay.
Or your local church.
Yeah, I think a lot of churches seem to provide that sort of help. So, well, this has been a really great discussion. Thanks again for kind of elucidating on the topic. And like we said, we'll have the research linked in the show notes. And thank you guys for joining us. I hope you learned something. And thanks for...
Oh, you're welcome.
And I'm looking forward to our next little discussion. Well, that about wraps us up for today. We hope you enjoyed the show. For more geriatric research, tips, or just more information about our assisted living, visit us at abbacares.com. That's ABBACARES.com. You can find the show notes as well as links to the research there on our blog. Thank you so much for joining us, and here's to aging well.